So indeed, what I'd like, I started my thinking about complexity a very long time ago, in the previous century, when I graduated in physics doing some agent-based modeling on the distribution of galaxies in the universe, which was a little problem, and trying to explain how you could get from a smooth situation to the fractal distribution that you observe today. Then I spent the next 22 years in industry, but I've always been interested in connecting these two things. I've been a keen follower of developments in complexity, and trying and the question that we face today and that I was asked to address is, so how do you what's the application, what's the usefulness of complexity in the world of large business? So what I'd like to tell you about today is a project that I've been involved in as an external advisor. So I don't speak on behalf of the companies here, but as an external advisor. But I think it's an interesting story. It's an example of this friction, this interaction between the severely abstract but exciting and important concepts of complexity science and the real worlds of large companies who are trying to get stuff done. So. What I want to go through is tell you the story of this Resilience Action Initiative. What is it? Why did it come together? Say something about resilience. Now, many of you will have some ideas. Some of you will be huge experts on resilience. But to give you a sense of how these companies have looked at it, I'll tell you a little bit about what RAI has done. And then conclude on some questions for science. So what things would actually be useful to have resolved in order for these companies to be able to get ahead with the problem they've posed? So that's basically the agenda for the next half hour or so. And it really is, in some ways, as Carlo left it this morning, is trying to connect big ideas with practical problems. So the big ideas being ideas of resilience and complexity, and ultimately, large corporations do actually quite simple things in our world. Really, they try to make a difference on fairly practical and fairly limited problems. So it's trying to connect these two things. So this is Peter Voser, who has just stepped down as the CEO of Shell. And this story started in Davos 2 years ago when he got together with a number of his colleagues. And in fact, there were 10 CEOs from large multinational corporations. And as happens in the rarefied air of Davos, they think more abstractly and they think of their grandchildren and they think grander thoughts and not just shareholder value. So the question they pose themselves is the following, is that companies pretend, and this is a lot of the narrative in business press, etc., that you need a level playing field and efficient markets and all these things, and that's where companies operate well. But the discussion they had, they said, we're actually kidding ourselves. The world is becoming more turbulent, and we have some idea why. So we actually need to take this head on and think, how do we, as somewhat relevant large companies in the world, do we play and contribute in a world of turbulence rather than simply looking for those smooth playing fields and being successful there? So a severely abstract question, not an urgent one in many ways to them because they'll do well for a while, but a very fundamental one for their role in the world for the long time. And the question focused specifically around being practical companies, they said, well, let's take something concrete that we understand. And that's the interconnection between the water, the energy, and the food systems. That's one where all these companies somehow operate. And these systems are all interconnected. The first thing is that demand is rising rapidly in all of these systems. So energy demand is increasing and is due to be up to double, and food demand is up through population, and water demand is up. And this is both from more people and richer people. So a very simple driver. But the interconnections are deep. You actually need a huge amount of water to run your energy systems. You obviously need lots of water for food, but you also need energy for food in terms of producing fertilizers and transporting the food to market. So these are systems that are very, very deeply interconnected. And the problem is they're more and more tightly coupled as we get to the edge of the operating regime of these systems. So water's tight, food's tight, energy's tight. We know that tightly coupled systems start doing weird things. And in fact, that's what you're seeing in the world today. And so the analysis of these companies is we're going to see more and more of that, because we're reaching, and you know, they haven't gone to the point, because that's of thinking about normal accidents, that these tightly coupled systems actually will probably trip somewhere because of that, but they're focused on the turbulence and the non-linearities that will come out of that. And the thing that obviously exasperates the whole thing is that those three systems operate in the context of a rapidly changing climate and a warming world, which actually feeds and reinforces this whole thing. So that's basically the problem that they set out to investigate, and say, well, how can we think about our role and operate in that context? So it's this idea of we're facing a more and more turbulent world, and that will require a different way of looking at things. And after some discussions, they chose this resilience lens of saying, well, let's take the concept of resilience and let's think of it as a lens, as a different lens of looking at the world. And of course, companies look at the world typically through an efficiency lens, right? How can we make things cheaper, more efficient? And looking at systems through a resilience lens is quite a fundamentally different way of thinking about them. The other element that was very crucial in the discussion is this idea of collaboration, is that in order to function in these turbulent, tightly coupled systems, you'll probably need a different form of collaboration, both between companies and universities and the public sector and civil society, because this is obviously about systemic effects. And these companies, while they may be big, in the end are individual agents in the economy, and there's only so much they can do. So the two big questions were, you know, what new insights would the resilience lens provide? And the second point was, well, what consequences would that have for the types of collaborations and the way we work together with others? And, you know, companies being companies, they said, well, we also want to make a difference in practice, so we'll call this the Resilience Action Initiative, because we actually want to try out some of these things. We want to find areas in the world, projects, where we don't just develop papers and concepts, but we try out a couple of things. We go into an industrial area, into a country, a province and city, talk to the authorities and say, how can we're, you know, big guys, we want to come and help you and think through this idea of resilience. So who is part of this resilience action initiative? And the membership has changed a little bit over time, but these are the companies that were involved in different stages. Most of these companies are household names, so none of them will particularly surprise you, and they span quite a broad range of the stuff and the services that we live in, right? It's not a trivial set of players. And the one that may be less familiar to some is Swiss Re, and I think it's just worth pointing out, but they're a particularly interesting company, is they're a reinsurer. So they reinsure the risks that insurance companies have. And in that sense, they are truly, and it's rare, they are truly a systemic player. They're interested, their core business is looking at systemic risk. So they were a fantastic partner in this alliance because that is their core business, which is not true for most general companies aren't actually systemic players. They're bit solutions, and so that's a rare. McKinsey participated as a learner, which I think is great credit to them, but is also rather unusual because they're typically the ones who have the answer to everything. And they actually do have quite a few answers in their defense, but this was also an interesting journey for them. So resilience, I won't give you a technical explanation of resilience because you know that a lot better. What I wanted to share here is the way resilience was being discussed in this project, which I think arguably in this context hopefully is more interesting. So the way they defined, or we defined actually, resilience is through two aspects. One is the capacity of a system to absorb a disturbance And that can be an external disturbance, like to an individual, a punch in the stomach, or as it's very often used, an extreme event, a tornado, a hurricane, exploding nuclear power plant, tsunami, all these things. But also, very importantly, endogenous shocks. So crime waves, the financial crisis, are endogenous shocks that come out of the system. But so fundamentally, is the system able to absorb this disturbance and largely able to continue functioning? But the second aspect in our definition, which is actually more interesting because that's where the magic occurs, is that during that disturbance there's a learning element, so that the system comes out strengthened after the event. And it's something we obviously know very well from the human immune system, whereby you inject something in order to get the system to learn and become stronger. So it's a similar concept. What can you do to socioeconomic systems so that they have a higher learning capacity, so that when stuff happens to them, they come out strengthened? And these things often do not go together. I was speaking recently to the head of WWF in Pakistan and asked him about the floods that occurred there a couple of years ago, which were devastating. You may remember a couple of thousand people died as a result of the floods. And the interesting thing is, he says it's because of all the development work in terms of flood control. Because what happened is that while technically there were fewer and fewer floods, a lot of the social mechanisms of coping with regular small floods have disappeared. And therefore, when a large flood occurred, there was a, so while the system had become more efficient, it had lost its capacity to learn from the disturbances. Now, it doesn't mean that you should have floods a lot in order to learn from it, but it's still an important thing to reflect on. And finally, it was quite a lot of debate in these companies, is that, they find it hard, and I have to say, having spent a long time in industry, I can still say we find that hard, to think of a metric that doesn't have an absolute direction. Now, of course, the thing is that resilience is neither good nor bad, right? It depends on the resilience of what and in which context. So apartheid was incredibly resilient, but most people would think that wasn't a great thing. Ecosystems are actually resilient. The wetlands between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which were believed to have been destroyed as a result of the Iran-Iraq war a long time ago, if you remember that one, have recovered to everybody's great surprise. So there are the idea of resilience is not an absolute good, and it should very much be viewed in context. So a way of trying to chop this into pieces, this idea, was to look at different aspects of it. The first aspect is what we called structural resilience, which is the fundamentally basic thing. So the first level of resilience, which where a lot of the debate actually stops at, is simply having buffers in a system. And that takes the very easy form of having a spare tire, which is really the most simple, but the fundamental idea of creating buffers. Now that obviously works, but it's probably the most expensive way to get resilience, because you just add cost to a system. Another way of getting structural resilience is through modularity. There's a really interesting case with the 787, whom you remember with the chutes on, which is well known because of the burning batteries. But actually a more interesting side of it is that it has 4 separate operating software systems that control the plane that are able to take over. And arguably the plane was safe, because notwithstanding burning batteries, it actually has performed fairly well. But the other aspect, which gets to our third point of diversity and requisite diversity, is that Boeing had those 4 operating systems developed by 4 different labs with 4 different technical and software cultures who were not allowed to talk to each other. So they've not only have 4 backup systems, they have truly diverse systems. Now, in one way, it's scary that if one fails in the plane, another system will take over that has a completely different idea of how this thing's supposed to stay in the air. But it does point to a deeper level of resilience that comes through that diversity. And the real word, the point isn't diversity, the point is the requisite diversity, right? What's the right level and the right kind of diversity for the problem you have at hand? And I found Jos Benschop's illustration this morning also interesting in the supply chains, is that you focus on redundancy amongst your suppliers, and you look at the big ones and you miss the small ones that actually are probably more fragile. The second level that we looked at was integrative resilience, and the first that has different dimensions. The first one is the multiscalar nature of the systems that these companies operate in. And there's this wonderful cauliflower that has a fractal pattern which symbolizes that. But if you look at a problem like the Arctic, the issues in the Arctic, and that's very topical, both because of the transportation and the oil and gas exploration that's going on in the Arctic and the fisheries problems, etc. That's a typical problem that has issues at all sorts of different scales. So the question is, how do you deal and how do you provide solutions as companies that are consistent with the resilience of that multiscalar system? Another really difficult concept to get into, again, from the perspective of a company that's focused on efficiency and getting cheap solutions out and functional solutions, is the idea of thresholds that you see in complex systems. So the big discontinuities, and again, through turbulent, tightly coupled system, we expect more and more discontinuities. Typically local communities, so companies operate in local communities that are often quite fragile. Now, how do you understand the stability of those systems? Social capital, another element of integrative resilience. I was last week at a very interesting workshop with the Chief Resilience Officer of the City of New York, which is quite an interesting job if you can. And he was talking about how they were trying to measure the resilience of local communities and trying to distinguish how local communities had reacted to the hurricane. So in terms of those who actually sat back and wait for the authorities and others that have been able to mobilize, and what can you say about the characteristics of those communities and the amount of social, and characterize the social capital that they were able to respond. And the final layer that was discussed is this idea of transformative resilience, is a system that has distributed governance is often more resilient than one that has centralized governance. And a great example of that are coalitions like the C40 cities that are trying to look at carbon issues as the centralized governance of the UNFCCC process seems to stall and fail. Some people here have mentioned the idea of scenarios as a way to understand complex systems and to engage with complexity. And it was very much part of the dialogue. Also, the scenarios, the more general term is the foresight capacity, and the state of Singapore that is quite leading in that area. And the final category in transformative resilience is innovation and experimentation. Now, but with a specific lens, obviously companies innovate and experiment and do R&D. That's not the point here. The point is, can you view innovation as experimentation as a tool for transformation and learning and continuing to be sensing and to look for different, and for societies to look for different paths? Google has institutionalized that, for example, by telling their employees that they could spend 10% of their time on whatever they want. And it's a little bit perhaps also what Carlo was encouraging us, as long as you pick good people, give them the space to experiment, and as long as they do it with that attitude. So that gets us to the question, so that this gives you a sense of the level of the discussion and the way the concepts were framed for these companies. And again, this was not about the resilience of the companies, right? This is about the resilience of the socioeconomic systems in which these companies sell their products and services. The resilience of the companies themselves is their problem. They work on it all the time. It's called make money and have your share price go up. I mean, that isn't really the point here. The point is large companies essentially in the long term survive because they do useful things for society. And if the need of society changes because of this turbulence, then they need to adapt and be able to work in them in a different way. So that was really the question. So what have they done? Well, the activities were essentially in two buckets. One was pilot projects, and the whole initiative has been, for very conscious reasons, been left quite low-key. Nobody's waiting for a bunch of multinationals to say, hey, we've cracked resilience, because, first of all, nobody would believe that, and it's also quite irrelevant. So it was never meant to be secretive, but to say, listen, we want to learn in a semi-protected way, and so we can do some things. So I won't describe all the pilots because they haven't been made public, and some of them, and they're very different. But to give you a sense of it, there's one rather major initiative that looks at the energy transition in South Africa, which is trying to together with the South African government, take a perspective on this interaction between food, water, energy, and climate change, and see how could framing this as a resilience problem change the way you analyze and you deal with it. And that includes all the aspects that we talked about, multi-scalar interactions, so you can look at this at a scale up. Southern African countries, coal in Botswana, water in Namibia, biofuel from Zimbabwe, etc., and scales down when you look at distributed energy and ways of dealing with water. So there were a number of these pilots where the companies worked together and tried to apply the concepts that they developed in practice. And separate from that, there were a number of knowledge projects, which was really jointly developing both knowledge, but actually a shared vocabulary. One of the important things is that many of the words that we use in complexity science are actually unfamiliar in business. And the C word, the complexity word, actually was quite delicate to introduce. And the project was about resilience, but interestingly is that in the course of the 2 years, there's more and more talk about complex systems, which is truly, of course, the context of this. But language matters a lot. So what we did is we developed a resilient methodology toolkit. So a diagnosis is, if you have a project, a society, a city, or whatever, how can you in a systematic way do a diagnosis on what the resilience issues are? And so that you both have a methodology, a way of engaging, and words to do it with. There was a project on green infrastructure, particularly interesting. There are all sorts of technologies for dealing with, for example, with waste. You can create, or for water management, you can either build a water treatment plant, but you can also create an artificial wetland. And they're very, and this exists in many different technologies, and it's a very different way of tackling a problem, which has very different resilience attributes. And also, many of these companies are involved in various aspects of it. So they looked at, why doesn't that happen more? What are the barriers? What are the issues with that? There was some work done on collaboration for resilience. I already mentioned that in the beginning. So how is collaboration different when you look at things through a resilience lens? Simply putting things out to the lowest bidder is obviously not a bad system, but it does lead to certain outcomes, and cumulatively it leads to certain systemic properties. So the question is that the right way of going about it, and what's the alternative? There was a project on resilience and risk management. This was the only project that aimed at the resilience of the companies themselves. So just this one, which was looking at integrating resilience into corporate risk management systems. Finally, which is also worth mentioning, is we developed a board game. It's called Nexus, ! And it's actually shareable if people are interested in it. It's come out really well. It's a very exciting board game, up to 12 people to play, but afterwards to have a discussion about, what are the trade-offs, what are the dynamics, collaboration systems, etc. It really brings out a lot of these issues. And finally, there are multiple initiatives out there. One of the ones I would want to point to is the Rockefeller Foundation has just launched this project called the 100 Resilient Cities. They've put $100 million towards funding chief resilience officers in 100 cities around the world, and programs for that, which will create a whole community of practice of people, you know, responsible for real stuff in large cities and trying to deal with this resilience dimension. So also from a complexity research perspective, expect the questions on urban resilience to go up a couple of notches, because you'll have 100 people out there saying, hey, help, I need to know, you know, what, if you think about a city as a complex system, how do I manage its resilience? Rotterdam in the Netherlands is one of the first cities approved in the first wave of this 100, but it's very diverse. It includes cities on the West Bank and in Burma and New York and etc. So a very diverse set. So this is a growing world of practitioners who are trying to to put these things into practice, which leads to and I'll conclude there, to the final. To my final slide, which is, so what are the big issues that we came across that would be helpful if there were more answers to, that would help certainly this set of big companies, but possibly these cities, etc. So I've tried to bucket them into 5, and it's not, you know, meant to be an exhaustive list. And also, it may very well be that for some of these questions, there are actually useful answers in science that haven't made their way to policy or to business. One of the big issues in this world is that obviously there's a huge gap, and the science policy and the science business interface isn't particularly efficient. So that's also something to worry about. So some of you may say, oh, we've cracked that a long time ago. Let me tell you about it. So the first big question, which I'm quite sure isn't been resolved, is about thresholds in social economic systems. You know, what both the companies and some of the cities and provinces that we've spoken to struggle with is, yeah, sure, if we accept that tightly coupled systems will trip across thresholds, is help us in trying to identify what are signals that would be early indicators of thresholds. How do we think? How do we even plan for thresholds? The entire planning culture, both of business and public policy, is around extrapolating smooth curves. So if you put in this idea of thresholds, that is actually a totally radical concept, and so people recognize it and accept that it's there, but you know, you need a little bit more than just accepting it. You need to find a way of integrating it into your planning. The second point is a connection between specified and general resilience. So the concept of specified resilience is resilience to something you identify, and general resilience is resilience to the unknown. And what you see in the practice of policy, if I take my newly found friend in New York, who's the chief resilience officer, he's got a fantastic plan of 574 initiatives, and they're quite detailed. But they're actually almost all about fighting the last war. They're about dealing with hurricane risks, because that's what you can sell in the real life political environment, is saying, well, there was a real risk, look, it happened last year, and this is what we're going to do about it. And he realizes that's in this framework of turbulent systems, that only gets you so far. You actually want to be resilient to multiple unknown things, the next thing that could get you. So how do you, in a real world policy, get from specified resilience policies to general resilience policy? The third point is this big idea of trading off resilience and efficiency. In many systems, you see that a lot of resilience comes at the price of efficiency and vice versa. And the companies live in the church of efficiency, right? So the idea that efficiency isn't an absolute good is not a simple concept to keep alive in that culture. But it needs a little bit more than just a conceptual and some toy agent-based models or something to help you with that. You actually need a richer characterization of the relationship between resilience and efficiency that can help businesses make real-life choice. You know, where are the efficiencies and when can they be combined and when not, etc. Metrics are crucially important. There are very few metrics that you can use in the real world. One that I've stumbled across actually from the same professor I worked with on the fractals in the universe, who's Professor Pietro Nero, who some of you may know, has developed a method for characterizing economic fitness of economies and the resilience of the economic system. But there are few metrics, and we struggled like hell in this project to say, well, what are some real numbers that have meaning, that aren't just some sort of consultant's gimmick that you can put on a system, but what are really meaningful statistical measures? And then finally, the last category, which isn't strictly science in the deep science sense, but certainly in the business management and the financial economy sense, is how do you value and finance resilience? It's part of this collaboration structure, but when you need to put in backup capacity, when there are extra things need to be done or different ways of collaborating need to be put in, you need to figure out in the real world where the money comes from. Also, the banks live in the church of efficiency, and the way loans are judged are very much in the frame of efficiency, and it's financing for resilience is not a simple thing. It goes beyond saying that things are more expensive. That's actually not the point. Is they're different and they need to be valued differently, and you need to have the valuation tools and ways to get it through the system in order to make real life progress. And it's quite important to steer away from this idea that it's just about more costs, because the problem is actually much deeper than that. So this, I hope, gives you a sense of you know, a fairly large-scale experiment in terms of trying to get to these companies trying to get their arms around a particular aspect of complex systems, and trying to see how that can influence the reality of their day-to-day business and the way they collaborate, both together and with their large clients. Thank you very much.